Panjabi here. She's from Jadavpur University. I remember sitting in her class maybe 12 years back, listening to her lecture on testimonial and being amazed at the inspiring lecture that she gave. I'm so glad that you're here, Dr. Kavitha. Today's session is being moderated by Nawaz. He is a PhD scholar in the department. He is working on Making of Criminals in Colonial Malabar, a historical analysis. Over to you, Nawaz, to moderate the session.
Thank you, Professor Shiba, and good evening, everyone. I'm very glad to welcome you all to the 14th and second last session of International Online Workshop, Sensing the Past, Thematic Departure and Archival Searches. Today, we have Professor Kavitha Panjabi, who presently works at the Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University. She will be talking on oral narratives and making of histories. I hope this would be a very informative session followed by a creative discussion. First of all, I invite Jacinta, master's student at the Department of History, Sree Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, to introduce the speaker and welcome the gathering. Jacinta.
Good evening to all. Welcome to the 14th lecture of the international webinar named by Oral Narratives and the Making of Histories on Sensing the Past, Thematic Departures and Archival Searches, hosted by the Department of History, Sree Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, with the support of Kerala Council for Historical Research. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome the distinguished speaker, Dr. Kavitha Panjabi, for the day, who is here to deliver the talk. Dr. Kavitha Panjabi is Professor of Comparative Literature and Coordinator of the Center for Studies in Latin American Literature and Cultures at Jadavpur University, Kolkata. She did her doctoral research at Cornell University. She is the author of Unclaimed Harvest and Oral History of the Tibaga Women's Movement and Old and New Legacies of the Partition. She is also editor of the Jadavpur Journal of Comparative Literature, anthologies such as Poetics and Politics of Sufism and Bhakti in South Asia, Love, Loss and Liberation, and joint editor of Women Contesting Culture, Changing Frames of Gender Politics in India. Welcome, ma'am. A warm welcome to all the participants to the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by thanking all the organizers and especially Shiba for putting together this wonderful series of talks on innovative ways of approaching the past and for inviting me to speak. It's been a real pleasure meeting up with Shiva again after all these years, and congratulations on organizing this wonderful series. Given the number of scholars I admire who've spoken before me, I feel both humbled and honored to be invited to join this series. I'm neither a historian nor a social scientist, but as life is not lived out within disciplinary boundaries like academics is, so too I believe that the histories of our lives cannot be understood within the boundaries of disciplines. Now, while much of literary studies is informed by the social sciences today, what I wish to share with you are the ways in which oral history is enriched by literary studies. This too is not an unknown area of oral history, and we've learned much from pioneers such as Alessandro Portelli, Luisa Paserini, and several others. I'll be drawing upon some of their insights today as I share my own, and also hope to add to the work of oral history my understanding of the workings of aesthetics in the ways in which historical events impact people. You know, how historical events impact people aesthetically and what kinds of historical dynamics that sets up, especially in the context of movement histories. The disciplinary divides between the humanities and social sciences has ensured that aesthetics is relegated to the fields of art and literature. I hope to show how an understanding of the aesthetic impact of historical events can be crucial to our understanding of the dynamics of history making. But of course, this is not the only thing I'll be talking about. I'll just let you, in a few minutes, I'll tell you what the range is going to be. So this presentation is based on my book, Unclaimed Harvest, an oral history of the Tebaga women's movement. And it elaborates modes of reading and cross-reading oral narratives of the activists of the movement in the process of arriving at an understanding of the unique historical transformations they'd forged, especially the women had forged in Bengal in the 1940s. Basically, the Tibhaga movement was a movement of peasants, landless peasants and sharecroppers against the zamindars in the aftermath of the Bengal famine of 1943. And in fact, when we saw all the migrant workers hitting the road and walking thousands of miles to go home, the, and the levels of starvation we saw, the levels of impoverishment we saw, reminded me very powerfully of the Bengal famine, in which over 3 million people lost their lives. This was a time when the streets of Calcutta were flooded with peasants, with starving peasants, clamoring, Ek tu fan de ma, give me some rice water. And rice water, why? Because we know from the hunger strikes and hunger fasts around us that somebody who's gone hungry for days can well die if they have solid food. So it was only rice water they could take. And in a way, the famine became the ground for the politicization of thousands of women, both in the cities and in the villages. And it was in the langar khanas, the soup kitchens that were set up by the Communist Party of the times, that a lot of women and men began to interact in the cities for the first time with thousands of people from the villages. And many of us know it was a man-made famine. The rice was diverted for the war effort. Middlemen hoarded rice. Prices of rice shot up massively. And while the fields were green, there was hunger stalking all the villages. So it was known as a man-made famine. And the very disturbing experiences of interacting with thousands of starving people, millions of starving people, and seeing so many die at their doorsteps mobilized the women into asking, why is this happening? This was also the time when the CP had set up study groups in schools and colleges for men and women. So they had a theoretical grounding too, a theoretical way of beginning to understand, a historical way of beginning to understand why such starvation, why such impoverishment. Their experiences in the soup kitchen, their interactions with the men and women of the villages led many urban women also to join the left movement. Whether they joined the party or not, they joined the left movement. They helped set up Mahila Samitis. The Mahila Atma Raksha Samiti was set up initially during World War II to Atma Raksha means self-protection. Initially, for the to organize, to coordinate all the committees that had been set up right across Bengal for the self-protection of women against the Tommies and GIs, the British and American soldiers flooding Bengal. Ultimately, the meaning of Atma Raksha began to mean protection, self-protection against hunger, against poverty, against violence, of course, that it started with. It's really noteworthy that in 1942, when it started, the membership was 500 women. By 1943, after the Bengal famine had devastated so much of the population, or while it was devastating so much of the population of Bengal, from 500, the membership of the Mahila Atma Raksha Samiti rose to 45,000. So this was a time when huge numbers of women came into politics. And this was like less than 1/10 of the total number of peasants as well as activists from the cities came into politics. But it is estimated that more than 50,000 women participated in the Tebhaga movement. In the late 90s, I remember I was coming back from the Jaipur conference, Jaipur Women's Studies Conference, where we'd had very, very animated conversations about women in political movements. And I was a young teacher at that point. I think I must have just joined a few years ago, joined teaching. And I remember coming back with colleagues and friends and saying, I would love to work on the Tebhaga movement because we know so little about the women who participated. Tebhaga is like a 2-line note in our history books. And yet there were so many women who participated. What were their hopes, their visions? How did they transform their worlds? And I remember Professor Joshindhara Bagchi, who was the director of women's studies. who was in the train there, really encouraged me. She said, just start, Kavitha. And it started from those conversations, actually. I started by interviewing one or two women here, and then I went on to Bangladesh. And it was about 11 districts of West Bengal and Bangladesh that I covered, going from village to village, interviewing these amazing women and men. And it was, there were some women who'd written some memoirs. There were a few local histories, memoirs in terms of short essays. But we really didn't have any understanding of what the women's contribution was. And ultimately, as I began to do this work, I realized that actually there was nothing short of a women's movement that had taken place within the Tebhaga peasants' movement. So, my book is on this. Today, I won't be able to cover so much, of course. What I will be talking about is how I approached oral narratives, how I began to analyze, plumb, understand, grasp the significance of oral narratives, and especially across so many divides, because there were not just urban and rural divides, there were not just gender divides. A significant number of the people who participated in the Tebhaga movement were undercaste Namushudro peasants. There were also Shanthals, there were Mundas, there were Oraons, there were Rajbongshis, and of course, there's amazing people right across, many of whom had very, very sharp memories of the movement. So the lived past of the Tebhaga women had become, in its remoteness, it was already 50 years, right, since it started, when I started my work. The lived past had become like a foreign country to the present. And I'm obviously drawing upon David Lowenthal's terminology of the past as a foreign country. Yet, why did it seem so critical, especially for the feminist concerns of our times, to salvage this memory? And how was I to salvage this lived past? Not just to salvage the memory, to actually salvage a history of the past. And how was I to salvage this lived past? Not just a dry historical account, but an understanding of the negotiations, of the hopes, of the visions, of the transformations of interiority. I wanted to get to these. So these two questions, how were we to salvage this history? How were we to salvage, and why does it seem so critical for our times to salvage it? These two questions persisted and they haunted me through the years of this work. I was very wary of straitjacketing the Tebhaga women's movement with the questions of my time, feminist, historical, political, that was so different and so distant from the times narrated by these activists. I did not want my exploration of this movement to be framed by our contemporary debates and frameworks of analysis, and at least not to the extent that I could help it. What my approaches were going to be then, I had yet to figure out. All I knew was that I wished to start with a focus on the standpoints of the activists asserted in the lived realities of Tebhaga, and that I wanted to lend myself to their standpoints if I was actually going to not frame their lives through questions of my present. So it became very important to try and understand their standpoints. At at the next level, I also, as I said, there was a diversity of populations involved in Tebhaga. So I also began to cross-read each activist's narratives in relation to each other, as well as in the context of the local documentation of the struggles, and in relation to the few diaries and first-person narratives that did exist, as well as the popular slogans, songs, sayings of the time, all of which narrativize memory in different ways as crucial repositories of history. So it was their narratives I was reading against each other. I was reading them in relation to the local documentation and in relation to diaries and first-person narratives, as well as popular songs, slogans, sayings, that many of them which they remembered and quoted to me. So all of these I began to realize were narrativizing memory in different ways, were communicating certain histories to me. So each set of concerns in the consequent phases of the movement compelled me to look for more adequate ways of comprehending their recall, and in fact also their modes of recall in the present. It was not just what they were recalling, it was what mood they were in, what their attitude was, what their sensibility was, what their feelings were when they were recalling, they became very, very important. And that's why presence is such a crucial factor. And being sensitive to the power of presence is and the modes of communication. And these ranged from very impressive analytical narrations to very proud celebratory nostalgia to barely suppressed chuckles, sad wistfulness, furtive looks, self contradictory confusions, and also sudden, terse, grim outbursts amidst troubled, edgy silences. In fact, a lot of the contradictions, the confusions became major challenges. And as Portelli says, Alessandro Portelli, who's one of the major uh, pioneers of oral history, he says that the moment I see contradictions, the moment I see confusions, the moment I see ends not meeting, those are my challenging entry points. That's where I enter and begin to explore what the meanings of these contradictions are. That's what leads me to the real understanding of these histories. The nature of memory, too, covered a very wide range, from confident recall that was both joyous and critical, to very troubled, conflicted efforts to call to mind repressed aspects of the past, to other kinds of struggles against forgetting. There were also radically different modes of memory. You know, you had the individualized memories of certain people, you had the collective memories of others, you had the memories of Shantals, which were inflicted with a very powerful temporality that was completely distinct from that of historical time. And I've written about Ilamitro and the Shantals. I've also published that separately in the EPW, I think. And all these concerns of memory also gradually took up a very critical place in my attempts to understand the cross cultural dynamics of the past. I began to realize I had to understand these dynamics also through the lens of memory. Okay, so this is an attempt then not to address every factual aspect of history. This is an attempt to comprehend, and of course, the factual aspects of history are important, but the factual aspects, many of the factual aspects have been chronicled, the factual aspects that are considered important in terms of when, where, how, who were the power forces, when did which crackdown happen, etc., etc. Uh, I'm trying to understand women's lived negotiations with history, both in the realms of interiority. What were the transformations that took place in the realms of interiority? Where did they begin to get their inspiration, their courage, their power to transform, as well as their negotiations with history in the external world? So, what was it that impacted them, and how did they respond to those impacts? So, this work then comprises a process of identifying and grasping their conceptual approaches and weaving together several approaches to retrieve this history. And these approaches related to issues of memory versus history, subjectivity and intersubjectivity, and the aesthetic impact of historical events and their power, its power, the power of this aesthetic impact to mobilize future histories. What was especially beautiful for me was the realization that oral history, in its construction of a historical subjectivity for its forgotten activists, also has a conscience that Benjamin would have called the retroactive force of interiority. Oral history has a conscience that is answerable both to its makers and to its bearers. And this is what I will end the paper presentation with. Approaching a lived past such as this was a very humbling task. It became a labor of love, of deep respect for many who forged it, and it required lending oneself, above all, to their standpoints, their visions, their disillusionments, in the context of their times. Perhaps what humbled me the most was which they placed, the trust with which they placed the stories of their lives in my hands, the force of the commitments I shared with them, and also of the friendships with some, demanded that the ethical codes of scholarship be further extended to include the ethical codes of solidarity and friendship too. No university code of ethics can cover all that is shared in the friendships and bonds that can develop between one person sharing her life and another listening. And oral history work, that's why, has to be very, very deeply ethical work, as university codes of ethics will cover academic points, points of property, points of intellectual property, etc. But there are various realms that those codes do not cover. The meaning of ethics in scholarship took on a deeper significance as I tackled this double burden. It extended from respecting their privacy where they where they themselves expressed the need for it, to committing myself to stepping into their shoes, not only as a rational scholar, but also as a sensitive feminist comrade and sometimes friend too, to understand the complexity and nuances of their standpoints as well as I could, and also to continue to keep one foot firmly in their shoes with the other in my own as I began to represent them. I've tried my utmost to live up to their trust, not just in terms of keeping confidentiality and withholding identities of speakers where requested to do so. I've also tried to live up to their trust that I would do justice to their lives, their histories, and their visions. And I'm deeply grateful to them for all that I learned from them, for the ways in which they enriched me. So the rest of this paper I'm going to be talking, you also must have begun to wonder that if we are talking about such bonds and friendships developing, what happens to objectivity in such work? And, engaging with others. On the one hand, there's this whole question of bridging divides, of reaching out across divides of location, class, caste. On the other hand, it can also be of beginning to feel, if you share a certain commitment, if you see yourselves as part of a larger movement, even though from different backgrounds, and if you begin developing friendships, it could also lead to the misleading illusions that you share certain goals in life, you understand each other so well, you know each other. But the differences of location can be very, very important, and especially the differences of location in the cultures of individuality that we inhabit and in the cultures of collective that the Tebhaga women inhabited. I'm not going to talk so much about that today. That's there as part of my methodology chapter. I'm going to be focusing more on what I said earlier, the ways in which literary studies actually allows us to enrich our understanding of oral history. So I'm going to be talking about four things. I hope the time permits. One is the prism of subjectivity that became very important. And literature is transmitted to us through subjectivity. We are trained in the reading of literature through the lens of subjectivity. But what we're looking at in the context of these narratives is also narrations. They're narrative structurings of the activists' own lives. And it is through their subjectivity that these narratives come to us. So how do we approach this prism of subjectivity? That's one. The second I'm going to talk about has to do with questions of history and memory, as well as intersubjectivity across divides. The third I want to talk about is narrative, aesthetics, and history, the poetic truth of oral narratives. And the last, drawing upon Benjamin, the retroactive force of interiority, calling history into question. So, oral narratives, I began to realize, communicate through the dynamics of their recollection. And the significance of the narratives filtered across to me through the subjectivity of the speakers. And if one read the subjectivity of the speakers closely and across different accounts, they began to spell out the various hues of power, politics, patriarchy, militancy, as well as sexuality, agency, and intoxication. So the dynamics of human subjectivity became a focal point of this oral history. How do I use the term subjectivity then? The way I use it here refers to the historically and socially constituted subject, not as an abstraction, not as an effect of power and politics, but as the embodied female subject of history or the embodied male subject of history that is also constituted materially. Further, this subject of history is not just subject to, and thus constituted by the forces of history. This subject is also one capable of agency, a thinking, knowing, affective subject that in turn shapes history. Thus, subjectivity also connotes the area of symbolic activity that includes cognitive, cultural, and psychological aspects and forms of awareness, such as the identity and consciousness of oneself. And I'm drawing upon Pasarini here. In this, subjectivity also relates centrally to the dynamics of interiority that responds to affect. Because if the subject is not just one that is constituted by the forces of history, but also capable of shaping history, then what we have in the subject is the dynamics of being impacted and then acting on the basis of that impact. Right? So subjectivity becomes a very, very important prism in this work. Predicated then in the workings of agency, cognition, interiority, as well as the socially historically constituted subject, subjectivity becomes a useful lens of analysis, also for establishing the relationship between the cognitive dimensions of the personal, how one understands history, and the political significations of the collective, how one then participates in the collective politics and shapes it. So, as such, it embraces not only the epistemological dimension, not only the cognitive dimensions of the personal, but also that which is concerned with the nature and significance of the political. So, subjectivity is then located at the intersection of the personal and the political. The subjectivity of the speakers provides access then to both epistemological and political standpoints. And with women activists, especially, the narrative subjectivities are layered with their perspectives of how they understand history as it unfolds for them in their daily realities, and how politics is in turn textured by their standpoints and their agency, how they respond to history, what they do. So, subjective articulations then express the collective significance of the political realm, also by representing ways in which the subjectivities of the activists are transformed and in turn transform political movements. So the duality of the lens of the subject or subjective that constitutes subjectivity thus facilitates discussion of both subjectification and liberation. Why? Because the subject acts in history, the subject can act towards its liberation. And it's significant that Foucault, too, in his later years, extended his notion of the subject to one also constituted by liberation. In a 1984 interview, he had emphasized, "I do indeed believe that there is no sovereign founding subject, a universal form of subject to be found everywhere. I'm very skeptical of this view. I'm very hostile to it. I believe, on the contrary, that the subject is constituted through practices of subjection, or in a more autonomous way, through practices of liberation. That the subject can be constituted by liberation too, opens up the possibility of conceptualizing a free subject, or a subject moving towards freedom rather. It is this dynamics of liberation, not just of the collective, but also of the individual within, and maybe also sometimes against the collective, especially when you have conscientious objectors. It is these dynamics that I wish to tap in order to grasp the nature of both the liberatory as well as limiting nature of the movement. And the woman activist gendered negotiation with this tension. So the liberatory as well as limiting nature of the Tibhaga peasants movement, and the woman activist gendered negotiation with this tension. Okay, so the locations from which the activists came were, of course, multiple, but the subject of the Tibhaga women's standpoint was multiple and heterogeneous, with individual subjects very often at a tangent to others in the collective. The category Tebhaga woman was far from uniform. It ranged from the Adivasi Santal and Oraon to the lower caste Namashudra women to the upper caste women, and their standpoints were not in consonance with each other a lot of the time. So, such solidarities as the Tebhaga women then forged was across trenchant divides, and they transcended the ultimate debilitating privileging of difference, of quote unquote authenticity, and of the narrow quote unquote identity politics that are still the focus of much current debate. It was These were solidarities that were forged across these trenchant divides, and they transcended the debilitating privileging of narrower modes of identity. Um, okay. The actual transformation of subjectivities across social hierarchies, of course, was an exercise that required much self reflexivity. And there's very beautiful narratives of Tebhaga women where they talk about how their subjectivities are transformed in their interaction with women of other castes, men of other castes, of different classes, etc. Again, I don't have the time to go into all of those today, but I'm just marking that to say that this was not an automatic coming together of your solidarities just because they shared a common economic goal. There were major, sensitive, nuanced transformations of subjectivities in the work of moving towards that transformation. Okay. And there's especially one of the things that the women did was forge these links across the divides, and they also brought about amazing gendered changes in those unities across divides, where women say that when you ask them how did women transform the movement, they say women brought a certain sense of interiority to the movement, a certain sense of inwardness to the movement, a certain sense of internal transformation. And I was fortunate enough that they shared a lot of these narratives with me to talk about how these internal transformations happen. Okay. Um, so there was a lot of, even as uh, urban women learning to educate themselves, unlearning their privileges of class and caste in lived history to stand with the Tebhaga peasant women. Similarly, peasant women learning about what's happening in the world. Now, what's interesting is that the meaning of each event for the activists, as may be expected, were not easily available to me. For in the work of oral history, as Dory Laub says, knowledge is not simply a factual given. It is an advent. It is an event. It involved a process of arriving at, of facilitating the emergence of particular kinds of knowledge, of understanding what they meant by certain terms, by certain phrases. There was a process of grasping their meanings, which actually involved conscious intersubjective reflection on our part also, of working my own way into other modes of being and knowing. So, in this way, engaging with another subject's virality is like being in a relationship across a period of time and gradually uncovering layers of meaning as you get to know the person. And very often, these layers of meaning are replete with contradictions. Sometimes they're forever baffling, and sometimes they foster intellectual and human understanding of the other. Now, this is something that was already happening amongst the Tebhaga women and men across various divides. And I began to realize that in order to understand them, I also had to go into these processes of intersubjectivity, put myself in their shoes, understand things the way they meant it. Okay. So, at the level of engaging with a range of women in a multiplicity of identities that constitute a collective, such work also amounts to what Luisa Paserini has termed the study of the history of subjectivity, the impact of social and cultural change. The subjectivity of the women accessible in these oral narratives, in turn, also bears critical import for a theoretical reassessment of what constitutes history. Because the epistemic privilege of hitherto marginalized women derives from their specific gendered roles and locations in historical struggle. Um, Okay. What I will go on to now is the questions of history and memory. But before I do that, I would then like to end the previous section by saying that one's interest in the subject then is not merely to have the subject conform with one's own sense of the political, but also to restore to the larger picture, as part of one's legitimate history, the significance of multiple perspectives, as well as of the hitherto unspeakable that history has elided so far. It is to create the space for the emergence of that which has not yet been spoken, that may not conform with one's own sense of the political, that may never have been a part of one's sense of the political also. So, how do we create that space through oral history for the emergence of that which so far has been unspeakable? Okay. History, memory, and intersubjectivity. One second. Yeah. So what happened was that history did not seem to have a place for such narratives or for such dynamics of narration. History, after all, was more about gathering different perspectives, largely from archives, of trying to aim for. And its rupture with the lived pasts of activists had made history too distant from the past. Are you saying something, Shiba? Yeah.
Kavitha, is your video?
No, I've switched it off for 5 minutes while I'm drinking water, etc.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Can you hear
That's
me?
okay, fine.
Yeah.
Yes,
I
of
don't
course.
want to be drinking
Yeah,
water while I'm talking. Okay. So I'll
no
be
issues.
yeah, I'll
No
come back
issues.
in a few
Sorry.
minutes, really. So history did not seem to have a way of approaching these narratives. And it's also, its privileging of factual veracity crushed the very impact of events that transform the subjectivity of people. Because when you're talking about the impact of events, transformations of subjectivity, factual veracity is not the central question. The central question is impact and how that impact then fuels historical transformation. Also, history's preoccupation with temporal continuities, with the relationship between periods, left one defeated in the attempt to grasp the importance of a movement that in itself had marked a break between the lived realities of the past and the obsession of a present rapidly moving into the future. And here I'm quoting Nora also, Pierre Nora. So history had no time for the languages of gesture, tone, and silences, for the contradictions and the stories underlying false recollections, for the distortions. There was evidence of complex negotiations with lived history in these narratives that history writing could not accommodate. And, I've got several examples of this. I'm not going into it, where very often you would have people narrating certain histories to me or reading certain histories from things they'd written down. And you meet somebody from a year ago or another stage of their lives, and they say, did they really say this happened to them? This happened to me with Ila Mitro when I went to meet her biographer, Malika Begum, in Bangladesh. She said, did Ila Mitro really tell you that this happened to her, that she was tortured in this manner? I said, yeah, she did. So she said she never told us this. We had to get a testimony out of court. The testimony she presented 50 years ago. We had to dig that out of court 10 years later, 15 years later, whatever, and then circulate that. And she didn't acknowledge it as hers earlier. So how do you deal with these contradictions? History doesn't give you a way of dealing with them. So you obviously have to move to other approaches in order to be able to plumb these confusions and contradictions. So the thing is that there is a certain distance between history and memory that in a way needs to be bridged. And how do we begin to bridge that? What happens then is that, memory is a continuous yet dialectical process. And when you're doing oral history, you are talking to activists who are recalling their memory and who are actually in a dialectical process of engagement with their own pasts. And history, on the other hand, is a mode by which modern societies organize a past that they're condemned to forget because they're driven by change. This is what Pianora says. Also, what you have is memory extends from the past into the present and directs the future, whereas history is constituted as a definite break with the past. Memory can be that of a specific collective, yet of the individual too. But history has this problematic universalism and professionalism as that which affirms its own logic rather than the logic of the past. It's the professional logic that determines history. So it's not the. So what happens is that while memory does throw up critical challenges for history, on the other hand, can a sincere historical engagement with the past not open itself up to the logic of other times too? Can it not circumvent the problems inherent in a generalized universalism, especially if it's sensitive to the sense of lived pasts? How do we bridge this chasm between history and memory, where sincere historical engagement with the past is made possible while understanding what memory can yield to us? It's this bridging between history and memory that becomes the challenge in such oral history work. And the more complex problem here is of grasping the specific ways of relating to the past. For if one does not understand the impossibility of grasping any sense of an authentic past, that there is no way one can access an authentic past. If once one understands that, and also understands one's inability to grasp that in terms of its exact organicity for the narrators of memory, then one can't but agree with Benjamin that Benjamin says to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. For we may never be able to access that. How then can we understand our investment in the past given such an approach? The answer can be found only in the specific possibilities, maybe even the lost possibilities, to which the memory of the past can lead us. In what ways can the past be, was the past significant? How does that relate to us? So there's a lot that's been written on this whole question of memory and history. And there's wonderful oral historians like Saul Friedlander, David Koch, David Young, Gertrude Koch, who've written a lot in that. I'll move on to I've got two more things to talk about, so I'll move on to that. When I'm looking at oral narratives, as I said, I'm looking at narratives, I'm looking at representation. And I had actually been wondering how to approach the narratives. And interestingly, it was Holocaust scholarship that helped me approach this, because there were analysts who'd been engaging with the survivors' narratives. And there were analysts who were trained in literary studies engaging with survivors' narratives like Dory Laub, Shoshana Feldman. And survivors' narratives were then seen as a mode of representation. The survivor's narrative was a mode of the narrative mode, the mode in which the survivor narrated, represented his or her past. And that can then provide access to the complexities of a conflicted past. So, from the framing and structuring of the narratives and narrative voice, from the intertwining of voices and the dialogical character of narratives, from the ellipses, pauses, and contradictions, from the context of the narrator as storyteller and her role in offering counsel, as Benjamin would say, from careful cross-readings of narratives as well as silences, and above all, from the workings of the aesthetic impact of events on the subjects of history, and from a hermeneutic reading of narratives, one began to understand these representations. So while the insights of historiographers and of course oral historians were critical, the work of making meaning became primarily a mode of exploratory intersubjective work in the literary readings of the narratives. Now, when you're looking at the vicissitudes of memory, it's in any case difficult to make direct use of narratives for explicitly revealing facts and events. Memory can be, there can be lapses of memory, there can be distortions of memory. You can't make direct use of oral narratives in that sense. So, two insights of oral history played a very central role in this context. One is of the symbolic character of representations, even the symbolic character of false memory. And the other is, when certain recalls of memory have a symbolic power, and it's that symbolic power that you need to understand. The other is in relation to the impact of events that are represented in the recognition of the potential influence on forms of actual behavior. And it's in this that the epistemological bridging becomes crucial in learning to recognize how events impacted people, what was their aesthetic response that mobilized them into certain kinds of action, and what was it that made them consequently shape their own histories in the way they did. And this is something I think all of us in our own lives, in small ways, would be familiar with, how certain events impact people in very powerful ways. Now, we can go in to see a Greek tragedy, we can go in to see a tragic play and be very deeply impacted by it, and we can come back with a powerfully articulated aesthetic response to it, right? But why is aesthetics relegated only to the field of art and literature? I mean, day in and day out, history is impacting us aesthetically. It is eliciting aesthetic responses from us. And a lot of our actions are determined by the ways in which history impacts us. All the rasas we talk about, the Karun ras, the Veer ras, etc., all of these are present in our daily lives, and we are responding through these rasas. So what their aesthetic response was that mobilized them into certain kinds of action. And it is these aesthetic responses that ultimately makes people shape their own histories in the way they did. So I'll give you an example. There is this very famous poem in Hindi. It's by Subhadra Kumari Chauhan. It's about the Rani of Jhansi and what a brave woman she was. And most of us loved it because of its powerful rhythm, but even more so because of the heroic character of the queen. And the refrain goes that sword began to flash in 1857, Chamakuti San Sattawan mein. Vah talwar purani thi. It was an old sword. Bundele harbolon ke muh humne suni kahani thi. We had heard this story from the Bundels, from the Harbols of Bundelkhand. So the Harbols are a tribe of Bundelkhand, and they had narrated this story to us about this brave Rani, about this brave queen who had jumped up on her horse. Once her husband died, she jumped up on her horse, took up the sword, challenged the British, and General Walker was so petrified that he went away. Now, this was a poem that became a major nationalist poem in the 40s, and all of us grew up believing this really happened. Did any of us ever question the veracity of this story? Nobody thought of it. Did anybody ever go into the archives and look up whether the Rani actually did this, whether she actually jumped onto the horse, drew the sword on Walker, Walker ran away? But we all believed it happened. And the nationalist power of this poem, the historical relevance of this poem, lies not in the verifiability of the factual details of this anti-imperialist queen that is narrated in the poem. Whether it actually happened or not is not the secret of the power of this poem. The power of this poem derives from the fact that the Bundelis perceived her to have led a war of independence against the British in 1857. And this belief in turn contributed to the mobilization of the nationalist movement in the 1940s. This poem was a major inspiration. So how the Rani of Jhansi is commemorated in public memory is far more important in terms of the dynamics of history than whether she really jumped onto a horse and injured General Walker or not. The factual veracity of that act has become irrelevant. How she is actually commemorated in public memory is what inspires people into their nationalism. So the thing is that factual accuracy is not the central premise of oral history. As Alessandro Portelli too established in his book, The Death of Luigi Trasulli, it is not the factual accuracy of memory, but the nature and meaning of memory that becomes significant in oral recollections of the past. It is the poetic truth of events to which oral history lays claim. It is the nature and meaning of memory, it is the poetic truth that these events convey to you, to which oral history lays claim. So, basically, one needs to broaden the notions of historical validity and credibility and factuality to grasp this poetic truth of historical events, or the poetic truth of political events, for those very actors who shape history. For it is the significance of these events in people's lives that inspire their consequent actions that in turn shape future histories. Okay, I'll move on to the last section now. Okay, no, I just want to give you an example from Tebhaga of this whole thing. He says, if you look at okay. Yeah, there is one more point that I want to bring up before I move on from this section. It's what Gertrude Cox says is about how we approach knowledge. Whatever knowledge, she says, we have in terms of facts that we believe to be true remains dead as long as we fail to make use of that knowledge to interpret, communicate, and mediate facts. The real life of knowledge, she says, goes beyond mere factual information. In this sense, it is that which enables us to understand or explain meaning, intentions, emotions, reasons. And I'll give you an example of this, what we mean by the real life of knowledge. A central reason for the entry of hundreds of urban women into the Tebhaga movement relates to the life of one such fact. Almost every urban woman I spoke to pointed to the Bengal famine of 1943 as a turning point in her life. This was a time when thousands of starving peasants were flooding the towns and cities of Bengal in search of nourishment. The cry of "Ektu fan de ma," give me some rice water, mother, was heard on every street. And emaciated peasants would turn up outside kitchen windows, and the kitchens would be on the ground floor outside the house in those days. So women would be cooking, and the peasants would turn up in the hope of some rice water. Often women cited having seen women, men, or children dying from starvation. The deep impact of this was what all the urban women referred to as the reason for first joining the langar khanas, or the soup kitchens, as volunteers for distributing food, and then joining study groups and meetings to understand the politics behind such devastating hunger in a time of plenty. For it was a famine caused by man-made scarcity, not by natural drought. And it was the memory of such distress and injustice that propelled them into political activisms and dreams of a just future. So the famine remains dead as a fact in relation to those urban women until we interpret its meaning for those who were affected by its impact and whose future acts were shaped by it. Yeah, it's because of the famine that we entered the movement. That doesn't give us an understanding of the actual process. When we begin to interpret what the famine meant in terms of the experience of the women, how it impacted them, how did future acts get shaped by it? So this is the poetic truth of the past. Poetic truth steers clear of dead facts and gives us access to the mobilizing forces of history in the very realms of interiority. These are transformations that take place within ourselves. Such a poetic truth of history is premised on subjectivity in the sense of the affective aesthetic response to events. Yet the mobilizing force of history to which it gives us access does not inhabit the shaky ground of individualized subjectivity. So what's happening is that the poetic truth of history, the poetic truth is premised on subjectivity. in the sense of how each one of us can be affectively impacted and how we respond aesthetically to events. Yet, the mobilizing force of history to which this aesthetic impact gives us access, the way in which it transforms us into mobilizing history, that mobilizing force of history does not inhabit the shaky ground of individualized subjectivity. There are often historical events impact hundreds, thousands, communities of people in certain ways at the individual level of interiority. But then the mobilization that takes place does not inhabit the shaky ground of individualized subjectivity. That mobilization can be powerful collective mobilization. So you see what's happening: individual internal transformation, collective powerful mobilization. For when such poetic truth animates an individual and mobilizes her into historical action, it is an event of an order that has the capacity to animate entire populations. The factity of such poetic truth resides in the impact of history on the future. So, if we were saying we're not interested in factual truth, that's not correct. We're not interested in bare, dead facts. Poetic truth has its own factity, which resides in the impact of history on the future, in the concrete mobilization of acts, be they of leadership, resistance, or survival. So, poetic truth grounds the historicity of survival and resistance. On the other hand, poetic truth may also be associated with very, very retrograde practices. It may be harnessed as justification of hierarchical impositions, strife, vengeance, or even devastation. The poetic truth of historical mobilization is not an ethically laden value in itself. The mobilization could be a progressive mobilization, it could be a very regressive mobilization also. All we're saying is we have to recognize the dynamics of poetic truth. It only bears an explanation of mobilization on the basis of a perception of an event and its affective impact. Okay. So, there's lots of very, very interesting stuff in relation to poetic truth, written about some of it. I haven't written about much of it. Let's come to the last thing I want to talk about. Shiba, is it okay if I take 5 more minutes? Shiba?
Yes, fine.
Okay. So, what's very, very special about oral history also, we've been talking about transformations of at the level of interiority, right? We've been talking about the kind of subjective transformations that take place that oral history can enable us to access. But this force of interiority, what is it? Now, Benjamin's also talked about it, and I'd like to dwell a little bit on what he says. So oral narratives lead us to these subjective, aesthetic, and affective dynamics of interiority. And the thing is that the lived dynamics that we've been talking about between the workings of interiority and the politics of a collective rarely find place in any other genre or discipline. History does not tell us about the dynamics between the workings of interiority in an individual and the politics of the collective. Fiction sometimes may, but no other discipline does in that sense. Neither does any single disciplinary approach enable access to this absolutely basic force of human subjectivity. It's oral history that allows us to do this. Literature deals with the fictional imaginary, but oral history allows us to access this in real lived life. So the dynamics of human subjectivity in shaping history therefore becomes a focal point of oral history. And that's one of the things that I did try to focus on. Now, maybe then, okay. So what we're talking about then is the questions that can be addressed in the readings of narratives that actually traverse a half a lifetime or more. I mean, I was interviewing them after 50 years, and that traverse multiple activists from different locations, then that actually involve processes of historical change in the realms of interiority. So it's from the relations between interiority and the world of political action that I came to the questions of gendered transformation. Through what processes of subjective transformations did women locate themselves in the Tebhaga movement? What were the transformations that they in turn effected? And in what ways did this inflect the nature of Tebhaga? That's another whole, you know, uh, session altogether. Now, what significance or even challenges do these subjective transformations carry for our understanding of women in history and women and history today? Maybe there is, after all, a way of suturing this rupture between history and the lived past, of grasping the repressed, of that which we have repressed, of accessing the excluded dimensions, especially of gendered political standpoints. Benjamin, in his thesis on the philosophy of history, observes that class struggle is for the crude and material things without which no refined and spiritual things could exist. Right? He says that class struggle is for crude and material things, but it is for the crude and material things without which no refined and spiritual things could exist. Yet, these refined and spiritual things that are the very stuff of ethical ideals and historical visions also do make their presence felt in political struggle. This is what I'm saying. That these refined and spiritual things Benjamin talks about also do make their presence felt in political struggle, not in the forms of the spoils that fall to the victors. They make their presence felt in the very dynamics of the struggle. And Benjamin himself says this then. He says that these refined things, these spiritual things, spiritual, I mean matters of the spirit, okay? I don't mean religious right now. Having to do with established religion. I'm talking about matters of the spirit. It could be the spirit of courage, the spirit of transformation, the spirit of refinement, of liberation. He says that these things manifest themselves in this struggle itself as courage, humor, cunning, and fortitude. These aspects of struggle may be intangible, yet they persist and may be experienced even decades later in the realms of interiority. So activists who fought for these transformations, who may have fought for material transformations, they may have fought for material transformations that were critical for the refined and spiritual things to exist. But in the very struggle itself, in the very battle itself, Benjamin says that these refined aspects of life and the matters of the spirit did exist in the dynamics of struggle itself. These aspects of struggle may have been intangible, yet they persist and may be experienced even decades later in the realms of interiority. So when the activists are talking to you, it is these matters of spirit, it is these matters of courage, fortitude, humor, inspiration, or even dejection. They could be experienced years later in realms of interiority. They may even be experienced as regret. They constitute the inner voice of humanity, capable of calling history into question. These aspects of struggle that persist even decades later in the realms of interiority within the activists. These aspects of struggle constitute the inner voice of humanity, and this inner voice of humanity is capable of calling history into question. For these aspects of the struggle have, and I'm quoting Benjamin back again, for these aspects of the struggle have retroactive force and will continually call in question every victory, past and present, of the rulers. So these aspects of struggle, their courage, the humor, the spirit, that flooded the activists, that permeated the activists, they persist, and they may be experienced even later in realms of interiority when they are narrating, and they constitute the inner voice of humanity. And you can very sometimes you can access this inner voice of humanity in the narratives of the activists, and they have retroactive force and will call in question every victory past and present. The uniqueness of oral history work then is that it enables access to what Benjamin calls this retroactive force of interiority. It is that which is manifest in expression and tone. We're talking about movements. Many of us have experience of movements. We have experience of what Benjamin's talking about. It is that which is manifest in expression and tone, look and gesture, and even in the silence that continues to underline the narratives of activists long after that movement or history in question is past. It is that which is immaterial, impalpable, imperceptible, yet experienced powerfully enough to persist across a lifetime. It is what survives this retroactive force of interiority. This force of interiority that challenges the past also assesses the present in the realms of memory and recall. It defies the possible repressions of contemporary politics and acts as midwife for the emergence of historically suppressed perspectives that we can get through oral history. This retroactive force is the conscience of oral history. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kavitha ma'am. It was a really informative and interesting talk about the importance of oral narratives and making of histories in the backdrop of Tebaga movement. I hope we will have more discussions as we address the questions in the chat box. We have a few questions in the chat box. Can I read for you?
Please do.
Okay. The first question is from Elsa Arun. Oral testimonies can be considered as the oldest type of evidence.
Just a minute. Read it again, please. I didn't hear the question. A little slower.
I'll read it again.
Yeah.
Oral testimonies can be considered as the oldest type of evidence.
As the oldest?
Historian.
Oldest
type of evidence.
One sec. I'm also moving up, right?
Okay. It's there in the chat box, madam. From the Elsa Arun. The question. Elsa Arun, the question. First question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, now you can read it.
Oral testimony. Okay. Oral testimonies can be considered as the oldest type of evidence. Historians considered it as unreliable subjective source. But with the development of subaltern history, oral testimonies have gained importance. Hence the question, how difficult or easy has the task been concerning the pursuit of truth?
Yeah, see, that is what I was talking about for a large part of my talk, that the question of truth here does not have to do with facts, with time, place, action, number, who killed whom or who saved whom. It has to do with the ways in which history impacts us, the poetic ways in which history impacts us, the negotiations that go on within ourselves, and how we in turn mobilize history. So, this is a realm of impact, aesthetic impact, and motivation, mobilization that is not seen as factual normally. It's not seen as fact. But when you're talking about the mobilizations of history, when hundreds of people get mobilized into a collective in history together, is that not a fact of mobilization? So what we are talking about is the poetic truth of history that mobilizes people, and that mobilization then has its own factity. Okay. Yeah, we can go on to the next question.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. We have another question from Srinivasa Rao. You have talked about the transcendence of subjectivities across class and caste hierarchies. In this transcendence, would not the subjectivities goes through certain kinds of conflicts, at least in the initial stage of the interactions? Is it not a natural or different subjectivities which are backed by certain caste, social class obligations, priorities, to through certain tensions and rupture, and then through negotiation, consensus to emerge into collective subjectivity.
Yeah. Thank you for asking this question because I didn't have time to address it earlier. I'll give you two or three different responses to it. Um, yes, as I was saying earlier, that the negotiations across subjectivity obviously have to be thoughtfully worked at, right? And they can be very difficult at times. And one of the women I interviewed for a long time, and she became a very dear friend also, Rani Dasgupta, told me that, see, the men had gone into the villages first. Women did not go in the early stages. Urban women did not go into work with the rural women in the early stages, not just because of the lack of toilets, etc. Not because because urban women were used to that kind of infrastructure. That was not the reason. The main reason was the ability of the villagers to accept urban women coming in and working with them in the absolute initial stages. So the men had been the first to go in, and women went in later. She said that the women would often go on day trips or go maybe for a day or two. And she said, I remember when one of the first times I made a trip was in the mid 40s, just around the time of the famine, just after the famine, when the impact of the famine was still very strong. And she said, I saw this man coming towards me and he looked so familiar. And then suddenly I realized this is a person I know very well. And I looked at him and I said, what have you done to yourself? You've become a complete skeleton. Don't you eat? And he said, no, I don't. He said, how can I live here in the midst of a famine with people who have nothing to eat and feed myself? And many of these were also declassed zamindar family men. So there was a class negotiation that was going on there. It often came down to this, where you will eat only what you eat, what the people you live with are eating. If it means starving, you starve, right? There are other very beautiful examples of transformations of perspective. Manikuntala Sen has this lovely, narrates this beautiful incident where she says that, they were given, this was a very rich period in the 40s, where a lot of the activists would have access to literature from China, memoirs, writings from China, from Russia. And she said she'd been reading this book by a Chinese woman who was also an activist, and she was working with peasant women. And the Chinese woman one day commented to the peasant woman next to her, saying, look how beautiful the sky is. It's so red and beautiful. And the peasant woman said nothing. Much later, this woman heard the peasant woman tell another peasant woman, the skies are red, it's going to rain, our cattle is not going to get food tonight. They're not going to be able to eat after this. And she said, that's when I realized that what may be extreme beauty to me may be indicator of extreme hardship to the peasants. So how you view even the beauty of nature, what may be the beauty of nature for you could be the destructive force of nature for someone else. I'll give you another example. Manikuntala Sen herself says that when she was living with the peasant communities in the villages, once some colleague of hers came to visit. And when he saw her, he said, what have you done to yourself? Look at your hair, look at your skin. Don't you even use soap? And she says, no, I don't. She says, how can I use soap in this context? As it is, I'm seen as this urban middle class woman amongst the peasants here. If I happen to go if I bathe in the pond with everybody else. I can't take my fancy bar of soap in there and soap myself while the others are all using earth. So there were a lot of incidents like this. Ila Mitra, who was a leader of the Shauthas, it was fascinating how her narrative actually recorded her own transformations, because she was the daughter-in-law of a rich zamindar household. Her husband and she were both activists. After her husband got arrested, this was in Nachol, which is now in Bangladesh. After her husband got arrested, she went into hiding and she began to live with the Shauthals. No, before her husband got arrested, both of them had begun to live with the Shauthals. And she says, it took me a year to get used to the Shauthals, and it took them a year to get used to me. Because she said that I just could not get used to the way in which they lived, what they ate, what they said, and they too were very wary of me. But it took a year for them to get used to each other. But ultimately, the same Ilamitro, when she was arrested, she was sexually tortured to the worst order possible. But she would not give the names of the Shantals who worked with her. And the Shantals, one of them was tortured to death in front of her, but he would not say Ilamitro is our leader. So the kind of ultimate solidarities that this led to. But it did mean that Ilamitro lived for a year with the Shantals, and initially she considered them to be dirty. It's not that Shantals live in dirt, but there's certain food habits that an upper caste person might consider dirty in terms of certain things they eat. And she actually used that word. But this same Ilamitro across the years reaches a point where she will refuse to give up her political commitments and betray the Shantals. She's severely tortured sexually, but she will hold on to the bonding. And similarly for the Shantals. So it's actually a question of developing a familiarity with each other through close living, close interaction, learning to understand each other's perspectives and live with each other in that way, that actually led to these bridgings of perspective, habit, bonding, etc., across caste, class, etc. Does that answer the question?
Thank you, ma'am. One more question from the same person, Srinivas Rao. How important this tension rupture in collective subjectivity? I wonder that extend the collective subjectivity gives importance to one of the individual subjects that is not socially as equal to that of some individual subjects which socially dominant.
Yeah. I think that's a very important question. There are various ways in which one approaches this in the context of Tebhaga. One is that, the urban activists who were going into the villages were obviously educated. They knew much more about the world. They had their own ideas about what kinds of leadership strategy to use, etc. But remember, they were far fewer in number than the villagers. And the villagers were driven by their hunger. They were a very powerful force. The activists were going into their areas, learning to understand them, live with them, and bring to them certain ideas from the world outside. What happened in this context was that the activists very often found that though they were quote unquote from a superior positioning in society in terms of their class backgrounds, their education, etc., they began to also realize how little they knew in certain ways and began to learn from the villagers. And very often they would also find themselves caught in the throes of the movement in ways where it was the worldviews of the villagers, of the peasants, that dominated the movement and sometimes also came together, conjoined with their Marxist views of how to transform the world. And this happened in a very big way with Ilamitro and the Shantals. So Ilamitro was fighting the Tebhaga movement as a leader against the feudal landlords. And she was doing that as a communist woman. But the Shantals had begun to believe that, the story of the Shidhu and Kanu, the leaders of the a lot of tribal communities like Birsa Munda for the tribes from Madhya Pradesh, Sidhu Kanu from here, Birsa Munda, Sidhu Kanu, all of these tribal leaders, there are beliefs that they come back, that they get resurrected in life and they come back to lead movements. And for the Shantals in the late 40s, it was that Shidhu and Kanu had come back to lead the movement. For the empowerment of the Shantals, the time to arise had come. So sometimes the Marxist trajectories and the Chantal trajectories would come together. On the other hand, there's no simple answer to this question. That's why I'm giving you different perspectives. On the other hand, for example, when Ranadev imposed the armed struggle, um, not only was there conflict within the party in the 40s at the levels of leadership, if when you go to the South 24 Parganas, which is where the violent struggle started up after Ranadev declared the armed struggle, you still have people today who will say that, the Bada Sahibs can sit in the cities and without asking us, launch this violent struggle. They don't know what's happening with our lives out here. Were we ever asked what's happening? So you have a variety of different kinds of responses. These tensions and ruptures take on very, very different forms depending on the context. Any other
Thank you, ma'am.
questions? Yeah.
Yes, we have one. The next question is from Surya Krishna. Can you recall some of the most memorable moments in this exciting journey of collecting evidence and how it changed your sense of data?
Some of the most memorable movements or moments.
Moments in this exciting journey of collecting
Yeah.
evidence.
Okay. Um, the moment is actually a movement through that entire period when I was working, because it meant journey back and forth from here to Bangladesh. The first time when I was just going to begin working on the women in the movement, somebody told me that Amol Sen, who was a leader of the Tebhaga movement, and at that point was the leader of the Workers' Party in Bangladesh, he has come to Calcutta and he's in the MLA guest house. Why don't you go meet him? So I went, and Amol Sen is a lovely, amazing man. Very simple man. He wasn't too well that day. He was sitting in his dhoti and his vest in his room, received me like that. And he heard me out, and then he said, listen, if you want to understand what happened to the women in the movement, you should go look up Anima, who lives somewhere in Barasat, I think, and go and ask her, why did such an effective activist like her virtually move away, virtually go underground? Go underground, he meant in this case that she left the movement. I mean, she just withdrew from the movement. He said, go and ask her why that happened. Then you'll be able to understand. And little did I know how this one move of Amol Sen's would lead me to a whole different perspective. Because on the one hand, you had this complete joyous sense of liberation, Shanti, Anand, women in a collective, women transforming the world. On the other hand, what Anima led me to understand, in the beginning when we went to talk to her, she just refused to talk. She had a very vocal daughter who kept talking. So we came away very sad because she was very disillusioned, she wouldn't talk. After that, I went across the border to Norail, where Anima was from before she came. She had to come across in 47. And in Norail, I met her friend Puli, who had been a licentious child widow, and Anima had got her into the movement and took pictures of Puli, met her. I had also pictures of Amol Sen by then. Much later, when I went back to Anima with those photographs, then she realized her memory had been jogged. She began to realize that I was not just a person coming on a one-off thing for a story, that I was really interested in this history. And she began to talk about how when the Randev line was declared, her husband was one of the conscientious objectors. So was Amol Sen, but being a senior leader, he knew how to handle it more maturely. Her husband was young and hot-blooded and just rebelled. And he'd been tipped off by Amol Sen saying, you and Anima have to leave right now. Leave the country or your lives are at stake. And Anima talked very bitterly about how anybody who objected to the line from above would actually be killed off in front of her. I said there was no room for any dissension. There was no room for any discussion at that point in time, at that point in the movement, at that point in the history of the movement. And she developed such deep distress, hatred for it. But along with that hatred was a very, very deep sense of sorrow, because Anima would not talk much. Amol Sen would tell us more about her because he was very close to Anima and her husband. He said, Anima was the kind of person who had got her husband into the movement. He was a relatively better off peasant, but she had conscientized him and got him into the movement. And when she was filling up the party form, you have to give a reason there saying why are you joining the party. And she said that, the 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 a party that could transform a man who was like a wild savage into the beautiful man that became my husband. I want to join that party. That was the level of her appreciation of the collective, of the movement, etc. She also used to say, I'm going to write a novel, or I'm going to write a book which is called In Search of the Terrain of Love, because she understood that her love and her husband's love had grown on the terrain of the love of their people, right? Unfortunately, when they moved to West Bengal, when they came back to this side of the border after 47, neither could they join the movement here, nor did they have any other room for activism. And that the love of the people that had been the terrain of their love for each other, that disappeared from under their ground, and their marriage also fell apart at that point in time. So, there was deep disillusionment, deep political sorrow, deep personal sorrow. And the question that came up through all of this was also of the responsibility of political parties, where you may have full time activists dedicating their lives to you. But if there is any disagreement, do you then not have responsibility for them anymore? And this is something that used to actually torture Amul Sen. He used to keep talking about that. He said, we never understood that. And we've written off that period as an error, as a mistake. But he kept saying, go talk to Anima. And it was through Anima that he actually pointed out to me how we need to understand these mistakes, go back, revisit these quote unquote mistakes, and understand how they damage our lives and our movements. You can't write off these errors. They have to do with the cultures of the collective and our responsibilities to our activists. So it was a very, very enriching journey with just this one woman, the number of things I found out. Any other questions?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. We have another question from Anjana Joseph. Can you please tell us the tool or methods adopted to analyze the action, silence, and other symbolic elements of the speaker?
Okay, one I just gave you in terms of the silence of Anima. She just wouldn't talk to us the first time. So this was not planned that I would go meet her friends and then come back to her. But in retrospect, I realized that she was not talking to me. She wasn't willing to have her stranger disrupt her years of disillusioned silence. But when this stranger went and met all the people of her youth and came back, this stranger like me, I became a connecting thread with her past, with her history, with her friends, with her life that she had really valued. So that became like a catalyst for her to begin speaking. And also because she realized that I was also in touch with Amul Sen, whom she respected so much. So when activists began to feel that I was part of that larger community, not a part of, but that I was engaging with the larger community of activists, of their friends. They were responding to me. I also had certain, friendships or bonds going with some of them. Once they began to realize that I was not just a strange outsider who'd come to gather material and write it down for just my academic privilege, but somebody who was genuinely invested in the values of the movement, somebody who was genuinely invested in women's history, somebody who was a feminist activist herself in the present day. Once they began to understand all this, they were more ready to talk. And, even if we look at ourselves, if a stranger comes and starts talking to me and asking me about my life and my politics, I'm not going to talk to the person. But if somebody I know who's also involved in my kind of work elsewhere, who may be in touch with my friends, who may be working with my friends, who may know some people I love dearly, comes and talks to me, I'd be far more willing to talk. So you have to establish your own commitments as well as your relationships with the larger community of people in order to get accepted for the silence. There are various kinds of silences, of course, that continue working. I mean, this was one way of socially addressing the silence. Symbolic elements of the speaker, several. Let me give you one idea. Yeah. Uh, I was talking about Ila Mitra and the Shanthal, right? Uh, there was this young Shanthal chap who would always come late to meetings, and Horik. And he would always tell Iladi, don't worry. When the time comes, I will always be there, I promise you. When the time comes, right? They were all arrested at the same time. Horik was tortured in front of her. He was tortured to death. And he did not open his mouth, right? And Ila Mitra said, he always used to say, when the time comes, I will be there for you. And he was there for me. That's not the symbolic part. The symbolic part comes later. So she would talk about him, but every time she was talking about him, she would talk about herself also, about how she was tortured. So she would talk about how he was tortured. She would talk about how she was tortured. She talked about how he was tortured. And I didn't understand when I began to realize that Ila Mitra had a braided narrative. Her narrative of Horik was braided and intertwined with her narrative of herself. So it was like, this happened to him, this happened to me, this happened to me. One didn't understand why she was confusing the two narratives. And of course, I was the one who was confusing issues because I did not realize that she was not confusing two narratives. There was a logic in her head. And that logic was that Horik may have been tortured and died for me, but I was tortured too. It was in bonding that, I did not let him down either. So she didn't say that openly, but that narrative bonding, the narrative weaving was such that it tells you symbolically, in terms of that weaving, that he may have died for me, but I was also tortured for him. I did not let him down. In a way, it was also a functioning of survivor's guilt, saying that I'm still alive, he's not. But that survivor's guilt played itself out in the braiding of the narrative that I also was tortured and I did not give in. I did not compromise my politics for him. So these are various ways in which, close readings of the narratives, of narrative structuring, of the meanings of different words. A lot of these things begin to, the word antorikota, initially when people began talking to me about, when women began saying, when I asked them, what did women bring to the movement? And one of the women said they brought a quality of inwardness to the movement. And I didn't understand what that meant in the beginning. It was like, okay, they opened up their homes to outside people, they cooked for them, etc. So it was like, one happy family kind of scenario. Is that what they meant? That's not what they meant. What they meant later, that the word antarikata in there, how does the meaning of that word come alive? We were talking about Gertrude Koch talking about dead words and words with meaning. That meaning of that word began to come alive to me as people began talking about the kinds of transformations they wrought in society. So I'll give you one example. One of the things that, you wonder, women brought in so many different kinds of changes, they not only became leaders and took on leadership roles, charging at the zamindars' households or leading processions, etc. Not only when the men were arrested, they also actually began to transform the movement in different ways, because there would be Mahila Samiti meetings, women's units meetings, along with the peasants' units meetings. The women could also go to the peasant units meetings, and some places you would have special women, and a lot of places you had the Mahila Samiti meetings also. In Dinajpur especially, the women began to make demands long before city women began to make demands in relation to their right as laborers, as workers, their right to a life free of domestic violence, their right to a life free of the sexual violence by zamindars, which was also, of course, not just interclass, intercaste too, because you had rich Hindu zamindars and you had poor upper caste Hindu zamindars and you had normal Shudra peasants. So I remember at when we are talking about transformations of interiority, women began to demand that the zamindars would not have the right of the first night. There was a practice there that when a peasant got married, the bride would spend the first night with the zamindar. So the women began to demand for the abolition of that. They actually managed to do that because the movement was very strong in Dinajpur. I later realized that this was not just a feminist move for the women, it was also a very, very important move for dignity for the men because their conjugal intimacy had been violated by the upper caste zamindars. And when women began to make these demands and they actually got the rights back, it changed the nature of the marriage, the experience of conjugality, and it restored a certain dignity to the peasant's life. So, what you have is a feminist move in many ways, but it's a feminist move that's transforming the interiority of the peasants' lives and also winning the support of the men. The men were supporting the women not just because uh, it was upper caste men torturing their own women. There was a positive side to it. What would they gain? They would gain, both the man and the woman would gain in terms of their dignity. So, these transformations of interiority were very, very powerful in that way. So, this word antarikata, I realized, was being used not just in terms of inwardness, in terms of looking inward. It was that women brought inwardness to the movement, they brought inward transformations for both men and women, internal transformations. So there were various symbolic elements. I can't remember everything now, but here's just one or two of them. Any others?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. The next question is from Ilsa Arun. What have been implication? What have the implications been for the writing about women as in the unclaimed harvest?
I don't understand the question actually.
What have the implications been for writing about?
Yeah, I think she's trying to ask. I mean, the question of writing about women.
The question of
writing about women.
Yeah,
bringing women into the discussion of knowledge and as in the unclaimed harvest.
No, but
the question of writing about women.
Yeah, but what about the question of writing about women?
Yeah. How effectively came out when you talked about the unclaimed harvest? The need to place women in history. I think you talked about it. Yeah, we can leave that question.
We can have a more specific question. I think it's a very broad question.
Yeah, Navas.
How much has this account of the Tebaga women movement corrected or altered existing knowledge about the movement? In a very big way, I think, because, see, as I was saying earlier, that there are a handful of books on the Tebaga movement. You've got Peter Custer's book. Peter Custer sat at a desk, looked up 10 books and wrote from those books. You have Adrian Cooper's book on sharecroppers and shareholders. Adrian Cooper went from village to village in West Bengal, doing her research, doing her interviews. 20 years later, when I went, people remembered Adrian Cooper and the difference in quality shows in her book, right? But the thing is that in our regular history books, there's 2 lines on Tebaga, at least in West Bengal and in most other parts of the country that I know about, if it is there at all. You do have a few books on the Tebaga movement in English, very few in, and you have many more in Bangla, and especially in terms of local histories and all. But, and you also have women writing about their participation, a few women, like Manikuntala Sen has written about her participation. She's got a whole book called In Search of Freedom, where she talks about her involvement in politics, and Tebaga was a part of it. But so far, there has been no work that one knows of that has actually recognized that there was a women's movement flourishing within Tebaga, that it brought about major transformations, and how there were these networks of women working together, not just across urban and rural areas, but across various regions of Bengal. And many of the women continued to be leaders after the Tebhaga movement. Also, the urban women did in the movements that came on after that. But what this move, the fact that it was a women's movement, the kinds of transformations it brought about, that has never been written about. So, and it's very sad because what happened was that with partition and with the armed struggle and with the dislocations of the partition, with the different organizations crumbling on both sides, this amazing history just disappeared. And, when the women went back into their homes, much like in Telangana, and in fact, when I went to actually interview the women, very often their families would be, and when you go to a village, you never interview one person. There's the whole family and the whole village gets around you and sits there. So many people would be hearing these stories of the women and their histories for the first time. Even the villagers didn't know. So the fact that there was a women's movement that took place within Tebaga, and that was very, very different from the city movements. It predated all the city movements. It was completely different from Western movements as we know them. All this is knowledge that we've begun to understand through their oral narratives. Is that it?
Ma'am, I think, yes. Ma'am, I think we have come to the end of the questions.
Wonderful, yeah.
And thank you for your responses. It's time to conclude the session. Now I like to hand over the session to Mr. Blesson M. Joseph, Research Scholar, Department of History, Sree Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, to deliver a formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Blesson.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak and for the wonderful questions you also gave to me, and for giving me a chance to discuss some of the important things after the talk also. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kavitha. That was an excellent session. Very inspiring and memorable. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. It was good to meet up with you again, even if online.
Yes. Thank you. Same here.
All the best,
Thank
Shika.
you so much. Yeah. Thank you so
Bye.
much.